Today on the Lowdown, a Down syndrome podcast, Kim Humes gives us a lowdown on the information practices of Canadian family caregivers. Over to you, Hannah Marla.
Thanks, Danielle. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the LowDOWN podcast. My name is Marla, and with me here is my co-host, Hannah. Hi, Hannah.
Hi, Marla. How are you?
Ooh, I'm ready for another great episode. Let's get to it. On today's episode, we're turning our focus towards discussing a recent research study that explores how caring for a loved one with Down syndrome can impact caregivers and how this work is undervalued at the best of times. So today we're speaking with Kim Humes, who's a university program manager, writer, and sibling of somebody with Down syndrome. As part of her information management graduate studies, she researched the information practices of Down syndrome family caregivers. And this work uncovered a passion for sharing the stories of this underserved group. She lives and works in the beautiful Jabukchuk Micmac, which is also known as Halifax in Nova Scotia. Hi, Kim. Welcome to the Lowdown.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. We're very excited to talk with you today. We seem to share a big passion, so let's get into it here with some secret questions to get us warmed up. My first question for you is, which artist would you like to meet?
Oh, you know what? Oh, that's a hard one because there's so many that I love. You know what? I'd probably have to say Frida Kahlo. I think she's my favorite. I was debating, but I think she's my favorite. And I've loved her for so long. And she just had such an interesting life and was so dynamic. And, you know, I think as a woman in particular at her time, she accomplished so much and was just totally herself and didn't compromise for anybody. And I think that's really cool.
It would be, I'm sure, a really interesting conversation to have.
Yes, it would not be boring. That's for sure.
Not at all. My second question is very goofy. Do you consider yourself more a lemon or a lime? And why?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I would say lemon. You know, yellow's my favorite color. I don't wear a lot of yellow, but it's just such a happy color. I would say generally I'm like a pretty positive person. I'm pretty happy-go-lucky. I'm like, I can be sour sometimes, like for sure, just like everybody. But yeah, I think just because of the color and just, yeah, I think that would be what I would pick. That's a really hard question.
We have some interesting ones. We are on like season 9 at this point, so we have interesting questions at this point
like
in the game.
Hard-hitting questions.
Yeah.
Slow down. Yeah.
Love it.
Okay, I'll finish us off with the last question, Kim. Would you rather sail around the world or live the van life and live out of your van around the world?
Oh, you know what? I think I'd have to. I love boats, but they also kind of scare me a little bit. And I love the ocean. I live on the ocean, and that's one of my favorite things. But again, it's like a little scary at the same time. I feel like I have better skills for driving than for sailing, and I'd love to go on road trips anyway, and I would love to do like an RV trip just like around all of North America sometime. That would be amazing. So yeah, I'd love to just like get in an RV, and I think I could live in an RV for a few months and travel around. That would be pretty fun.
The RVs are getting so fancy now too, right? There's just like
they're like house size.
They're like house size.
Yeah.
All the amenities, all the technology built in now, so it's like a whole other way of travel.
I find those a bit much, but I definitely troll Marketplace for like, I love the 80s camper vans, and I'm like, someday I'll find one that's affordable. Someday. That's what I tell myself.
Tobago and really rough it.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I love those vintage style ones.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for kind of playing along with us. I think it's like Marla said, it's always good for our listeners to get to know you as a person first.
Yeah.
Let's start talking about our topic. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to do research into information systems, especially for families with a loved one with Down syndrome?
Sure, absolutely. So last year I was in my third year, my Master of Information Management degree at Dalhousie University, and everybody in that program does basically a research course near the end of their studies, and you basically get to pick any topic that you want related to information management. So it's very, very open, and I knew pretty much right away that I wanted to do something with people with Down syndrome. I actually was hoping to actually interview people with Down syndrome. With that, we quickly realized that given the very short time parameters of the project, that was going to be way too complicated. And we ended up pivoting. My supervisor is actually the one that kind of turned me on to talking to caregivers of people with Down syndrome and getting that perspective instead. And it made complete sense, again, given my background with having a sibling with Downs. And yeah, I just decided to, from there, connected it kind of to information management and decided to look at their information practices. And I knew I really wanted to do interviews. So that was kind of the format that the study took, was we interviewed family caregivers across Canada. So yeah, that's how it came about. I kind of had to do it for school, but it was also something that I had a lot of fun doing, and it was really fulfilling as well.
And it's great because you're kind of melding these two things in your life together. And that's usually the ideal thing when you work or when you do studies. It's like, how can I, combine what I love to do with what my life is? And kind of, it's just so much more meaningful that way.
Right.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you have a sibling with Down syndrome, or specifically a sister. Can you tell us a little bit about her and your relationship with your sister?
Sure. Yeah, she's older. She's my older sister, so she's 5 years older. So, she's been with me, since birth. And it's kind of was my mom and my sister and I growing up, kind of the three musketeers. And so I did have to help out my mom a lot with caregiving, which is why, I describe myself as a secondary caregiver. My mother was kind of the primary, but I definitely, was, again, kind of a secondary caregiver within the household. And so we've always been close as well, just because we had a small family unit growing up. And yeah, she's really involved with Special Olympics here in Nova Scotia. She does bowling. She used to do swimming. She actually works at a vocational center a few days a week and goes there. And she's been working there for, I think 20 years now. It's a long time. So she absolutely loves her work, and she loves movies and hanging out with her friends. And I definitely we live close by, thankfully. I live in my own house now, but we live about 10 minutes away from each other. So I do try to get together with her as much as I can.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You mentioned that, your mom was a primary caregiver and you're the secondary caregiver. So let's talk a little bit more about the concept of caregiving. Can you give us some background on caregiving, and how would you define it? And from your experience, how many Canadians are actively engaged in caregiving work?
Sure. So yeah, the definition of caregiving, that was actually a tough one when I was putting together this study, because there's so many definitions, and I kind of had to pick one to provide context for the study. So, I looked around quite a bit, but I ended up deciding to go with the Caregivers Nova Scotia version of the definition. So, because for me, it was just the most kind of comprehensive to what I was doing. And I think it's a very concise kind of way of describing it. So the way they define it is a person who gives unpaid care to someone who has a physical or mental health condition, or who is chronically ill or frail. Now, I will add the caveat there that, obviously not all caregivers are unpaid. Obviously not all care recipients have certain conditions. Like, for example, I'm a parent. I would consider myself to be a caregiver for a young child, and they don't have any particular special needs. So it is a more specific definition. So I think the definition kind of depends a lot on the context and everybody's individual situation, but that I felt like was a good general definition. I think the definition can really be personalized or self-guided depending on each person's situation. That's kind of one of the things that's really interesting about it. And I did decide to focus on family caregivers specifically. Unpaid caregivers are often called family caregivers interchangeably. It is important to note that, unpaid caregivers don't necessarily have to be family. They can also be a friend or some other loved one. A lot of the time, it is a family member, but not necessarily. So there are obviously paid caregivers. I decided to just focus specifically on unpaid family for my study, just because that's personally what I relate to the most. And, in my work, what I found was that group really does have a higher need for supports. Often paid caregivers have kind of supports in place through their workplace. And it's just a different relationship. So I chose not to examine that for this study.
And then how many Canadians do you think, or like, do you have statistics in terms of how many people are out there doing the caregiver work, especially maybe for the disability population, even if you want to operationalize the definition more towards that?
Right. Yeah. So according to Statistics Canada, there's about 7.8 million Canadians that are classified, that are engaged in caregiving work. So that amounts to about 1 in 4 Canadians over the age of 15. So it's quite a large number. I honestly don't have the breakdown there in terms of how many of those are attached to people with disabilities versus, seniors. A lot of the caregiving statistics and research that's out there is related more so to seniors or people with dementia. I did decide to go very specific with my research. It was harder to find, specifically statistics and data for people with Down syndrome, caring for someone with Down syndrome. But it gives you a good sense, I think, of just the staggering amount of, it kind of touches so many people, across the country. And that's one thing that struck me in the study as well.
And then we know that, caregiving can last anywhere from a few years to a lifetime. Everyone's journey and everyone's experiences are different. And we will kind of throughout this episode talk about the impact of that caregiving. But from your experience, what is the economic impact of caregiving in Canada?
So family caregivers in Canada contribute it's estimated about 5.7 billion hours of unpaid labor to society every year. So what I found in my study was that the estimated imputed economic cost, so basically the estimated value, if converted to economic numbers to replace those people with paid workers, would be 25 billion. So you would have to spend $25 billion in order to pay family caregivers if, they actually entered the working world and were paid. So the numbers are quite staggering.
Mm-hmm. No small change, that's for sure.
Yeah, and it's 5.7 billion hours every year, between all the caregivers across Canada. So it's a huge amount of really, why I keep calling it information work, because a lot of the research there's a lot of researchers out there, thankfully, that are looking at caregiving and that are working to kind of have caregiving, the kind of viewpoint on caregiving to change, because it's sort of not taken as seriously as paid work. It's not seen as similarly to, if someone, say, is a homemaker who works at home, who stays at home with children, a lot of people would consider that to not be work. But what a lot of the researchers are saying is that, this is work. Because it's work at home and it's unpaid does not minimize it, does not mean that it's any less valuable or that it contributes any less to society. Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. So when you talk about information practices of caregivers, what exactly are you referring to?
So information practices basically encompasses any activity related to finding, using, sharing, and managing information. So, and that would be specifically information related to their caregiving. So information that helps them kind of manage their care recipient's condition, or that's crucial to managing their care work on a daily basis. So, because research demonstrated, again, when I was doing research for my study, I found that most researchers are saying that information is fundamental to care work. Information actually empowers and enables caregivers and allows them to do their work better and makes their lives easier. So it's really crucial.
Yeah. And let's take some time to discuss, the kinds of information practices that are familiar for families, but may be unknown, to people who do not have a family member with Down syndrome. So what type of information are we talking about, and what is involved in this largely unacknowledged role?
Sure. So practices will vary depending on a lot of factors. The information that you are seeking, your information practices as a caregiver are going to be dependent on a lot of different things. So it'll depend on the family dynamic and the person with Down syndrome. How independent are they? What health conditions are they living with? The family's, economic situation, if they have any support systems or not, all of these things. So, some families will need more information than others. Some of them will need different information than others, depending on their situation. But this information could include healthcare information. It could include government resources, what community resources are out there, educational resources. So if their care recipients are in school, for example, there's sort of a whole set of information there that they would need to manage. It could include information about social supports, financial supports, all kinds of different things. So I guess a couple of important general points that came out in the study that I found was that there's no one size fits all. Every situation really is different. Every person with Down syndrome is really different. Every family's different. And that's part of the difficulty of applying resources, because there's so much gray area, And family caregivers are typically managing, in some capacity, every aspect of their care recipient's life. So you kind of alluded to this earlier, but it's a 24/7 lifelong commitment for most people. Even if they don't live with the person, they're likely still participating in information work in some way. They're probably still doing that. And the work is kind of never done. So there's really never a break. And family caregivers have a strong emotional connection to the person that they're caring for. Generally, their life and the care recipient's life are probably very intertwined. They probably know them better than anyone in a lot of cases, particularly if it's a parent, someone who's kind of been with them their whole life. They may understand the person's inner life a lot better than any other person. There's a lot of history there, in most cases. So these are complicated relationships and complicated situations. So, and there's a lot of, I think, emotion that comes along with all of this work as well. So that definitely complicates it as well.
Yeah.
Oh,
I think the advocacy component too, right? It's not only looking for the information, but then advocating for a particular service or a particular, service being available to your loved one with Down syndrome. Would you put advocacy into the category of information practices as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely found that when I talked to the families that, I interviewed, they do all see themselves as advocates for their care recipient in most cases, and they kind of have to sometimes be their voice. They'd say they sometimes don't have the ability to do that for themselves, and they take that role very seriously. And yeah, you need information in order to advocate. Obviously, you have to make sure that you have all the correct statistics. You want to make sure you have all the correct contacts that when you're going out there and advocating. So information work definitely is behind advocacy. You can't really separate the two things. They're very intertwined.
Mm-hmm. And just a note for everybody who's listening, you interviewed many families across Canada as part of this project. Is that right?
Yeah, I did. I will say this was a fairly small scale study. I ended up interviewing 6 different families, and I would have loved to have interviewed 100 people. I would have loved to have just done interviews for months. But again, the parameters of the study were fairly small. I had about 12 weeks to do the whole study, from start to finish.
That's nothing. That's research time.
It's a very small amount of time. And that included there's a whole process to obtain research ethics, and that's very extensive. So it was a very short amount of time. So I had to unfortunately limit the interviews to 6. I had actually great responses. I definitely could have interviewed a lot more people, which is disappointing. I unfortunately had to turn some people away, but we'll see. I'm hoping that maybe I can continue that work another time, but that's for another. Yeah. So I interviewed 6 different caregivers, essentially. There was one couple, and then the rest were individuals.
I would suspect that 6 individuals, knowing this group of people like I do, you probably were able to identify quite a number of themes just with those 6 different individuals or of the dyad. So I would love to hear a little bit more about what themes you identified with regards to challenges that families face in either accessing or using information.
Sure. Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit, but I will say overall, the findings. So the findings of the results of the interviews really did align with existing research. So there wasn't really any surprises, which is very telling, I think, because there is thankfully, a lot of research out there on care. There's a lot of research out there in caregiving. there definitely could be more on. There is definitely a lot around people with Down syndrome as well. There definitely could be more in terms of information practices specifically for caregivers hasn't really been explored as much. But there is a lot out there for related topics. And just as we said at the top, everybody talked about just how they feel invisible, and that their caregiving work they're very passionate about it. They love doing it. They get a great deal of fulfillment from it. And again, they see themselves as advocates, as we were saying, but it takes a lot of mental energy. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. Many of them are burned out. A lot of them don't have time or energy to do other things. Some of them have had to leave the workforce. So there's sort of obviously economic implications there. In many cases, the caregiving work is almost like having a full-time job, just in terms of the amount of time and energy that it takes. So, and most of the people I talked to did talk about how there is resources out there, there is information out there, but it can be very difficult to find. It's very decentralized. You have to kind of know where to look. A lot of people were saying to me how, I don't know where to go to find this information. So a lot of times they kind of know it's out there, but where do I even start? Because a lot of it's just so spread out. And there's so many different organizations. And some of it's on, most things are online nowadays, but some of it's not. And some of it's outdated. Some of it is conflicting. You might read something somewhere and then get contradictory information somewhere else. And yeah, just difficult to find. A lot of them just talked about how they had to spend a lot of time through trial and error compiling information. Yes. And really the information that they had because they went out and they had to put all this time and effort into finding it. So that was something that they mentioned a lot too.
Did you find there was a generational difference in sort of information practices with people who maybe grew up with the internet and how they acquire information and people who did not?
Yeah, a little bit. Most of the people that I talked to were in a similar age range. There was one caregiver that I talked to was interesting. She was a sibling caregiver and was relatively new to her role because her parents had been in the caregiving role, but they were aging, and so she had just taken it over. And yeah, she did talk about the fact that, there are people, maybe some seniors, that aren't as comfortable in online spaces, and then so much information now is online. They really struggled with that. They still relied on phone calling people and going to libraries and things like that. So I think that's definitely a challenge. That's something that my mother's talked about as well, just being in her 70s, and she's pretty savvy, but everything is online, and just trying to even talk to a human about something, to ask a question, can be really difficult.
And even more so, I think we find when there's a language barrier, it's almost impossible to get that information without somebody helping you access that. And of course, there's not enough social work to go around. So yeah, it can be key. I'd love to hear more about, given how you went about your project, what were the recommendations that you made as a result of these conversations that you had?
Yeah, so the main recommendation that came out of the study, there's some smaller ones, but just reviewing everything, taking everything in, the main recommendation that I had was that we really have a need for a national database for family caregivers of people with Down syndrome. So somewhere that's a central resource that people could go that would be accessible. Ideally, there'd be involvement from government and community groups. It would ideally be kind of a collaborative place, and it would just be a central place for people to find the information that they need that's related to their caregiving. This is, I will say, a very blue sky recommendation. It's a very big project, and it seems very daunting when you think about it. But just everything that I found out through the study and everything that I've read and personally experienced, the need is there, and I think the benefits could be really incredible. It is a big job, but I think we also are kind of at the point where we need these big ideas, and we need kind of big picture thinking, and we really need out of the box thinking. And it's obviously it's complicated, but I think it can be done. It's one of those things that you need the support behind it. I think from government would be pretty big, like that we would definitely need to have them involved. And I think trying to get their buy-in could be difficult, but it is something I think that's doable, but it definitely would require a lot of collaboration. And I would definitely recommend that caregivers and people with Down syndrome be involved with the process. It really needs to be a user-centered project because they understand the best what they need and what the functionality should be, So to me, it makes sense that they would be involved right from the beginning.
It's really interesting. I think one of the things that strikes me most about this work is this sort of inverse relationship with regards to the more complicated a person with Down syndrome's needs are, the more involved their needs are, the less time the family will have to seek out the information because they're providing direct care, physical care, more of the time, but also the more information that they actually need. And the more government agencies that they should probably be in contact with, and the more support that they need. And it's one of those injustices that really strikes you when you think about this issue, is that sort of disparity between needs and then what's there to accommodate those needs.
Yeah, that is very true. Yeah, the people that really need it the most don't have the resources to be able to get the information.
The least amount of time essentially to work with, right? And the most things to be researching. So
I did find in general that all the family caregivers needs in general are very complex, and they do change. They change a lot. They're kind of always changing because if you think about your care recipient as they move through different stages of life themselves, you're going to need very different resources for, say, a 2-year-old. You're looking at you have totally different needs in those different stages. So that complicates it as well, because I think it really depends on the age of the care recipient and what stage of life they're at. And then it also depends on the age and the stage of life of the caregiver. We definitely are in a situation where caregivers are aging too. It's not just care recipients. We have a lot of senior parents who are still caring for, children with Downs, for example. And I talked to one in particular, and there's definitely concerns about, what's going to happen when I'm gone, and having to plan for that. That's a whole other layer of information work involved with that. How do I plan for their future for after I'm gone? And people with Down syndrome are living longer, which is wonderful, but they also need care longer.
Yeah, and I think the dynamic shifts too, right? Not only the age of the caregivers, but there's oftentimes dynamics. So there's just one caregiver, or even the transition from 2 caregivers to 1 for whatever reason, right? So that can also add the load and the burden of, as first you had somebody doing it with you, and now you're doing it on your own, or you're bringing somebody else in, or you have a home share. There's so many different setups out there that I think the caregiver burden and the load changes depending on what the dynamic is in terms of the household too.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I mean, if you've been caring for someone for 40 years, I imagine it's very difficult to think about handing that over to someone else. And it's also daunting if you're taking that on, because then there's so much history and so much context that you have to learn. So yeah, there's just so many challenges at all levels.
I'm curious what your recommendations would be to caregivers who are maybe struggling to access the information that they need in order to provide the level of care that they want to and need to for their person with Down syndrome.
Yeah, I think the big thing that I would recommend, and this is something that the family caregivers told me that they really value, is find other families, find other family caregivers, and also, find other families with people with Down syndrome. Seek them out. So thankfully there are a lot of community groups out there. There's a lot of parents and other caregivers that have started groups for families. So look around your community and try to find those groups, even groups like DSRF and CDSS. I found they were invaluable when I was doing my research, because you guys just have so much expertise and so many resources available. So those organizations are really helpful too. But I think seeking other people that are kind of in your situation and making sure that you spend time with them, talk to them, because they understand your situation really better than anybody. Yeah. They're really the only people that really understand they're in the same boat as you. So maybe they have resources that you're not aware of that they can share with you. Maybe you can share resources with them. And all the families that I talk to like are actively doing that or have done that and have really gotten involved with other families in their communities. And they've really found that that was probably the biggest help to them in their caregiving role, like more than anything. And the research definitely shows too that, you know, because family caregiving is so emotional and so stressful, it's so important for stress relief to have that social connection and to have a support system around you. That's really, really important to help with your mental health. So that would probably be the best recommendation that I could give is just, I think that's really going to help you in so many ways, just seeking out other families.
It's interesting because that's really aligned with the sort of clinical recommendations that Hannah and I make. It's among our top priorities always, is to ensure that the family is connected to at least one other family who could relate to their experience with their child. So we try and create some connections that are very, very personalized to a family's needs. But we also have a higher degree of concern for families who are isolated or who don't have a connection, a social connection that they can rely upon. So it's interesting that similarity there.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that like during COVID, I know a lot of people found that they lost a lot of those supports. Just people were really isolated. They were at home more and just weren't able to. And many people with Down syndrome are immunocompromised. They're in situations where they have health conditions that, you know, you have to be even more careful than the average person. So that's definitely something that a lot of caregivers mentioned, was just that COVID made things really difficult. A lot of programs shut down and just, people were at home more and just isolated. So I think that I'm hoping that that's turning around now, but that's something to look at too, because I think just in the way that our world is now too, with everything being online can be great, but then people
it's not accessible
all the time.
Yeah,
can also be isolating. So you know, is it helping people if they're online all the time? And that human connection, I think, really that's always going to be super important. So obviously, it's great to like connect with people virtually, like we're doing right now. You know, like we're at opposite ends of the country and we're able to talk, and that's wonderful. But yeah, I think nothing replaces that kind of just people in your community, seeing them, meeting them, spending time with them and talking, just having someone to talk to about what you're going through. It's super important. That was definitely something that came up a lot in the study and in the research, was just like who's caring for the caregivers. You know, a lot of times they're not really being cared for. So that's super important for them to make sure that they're taking time for themselves as well. I guess that would be another tip that I would give them. I realize that's easier said than done. You know, it can be really hard to carve out that time, but just really try. Like, you just try to get respite when you can. Try to take breaks. Make sure that you're just taking care of yourself. And just remember that you don't have to do it all the time. There are supports out there, and there are people out there that want to help you. So,
well, Kim, it's been a pleasure to chat with you today and go through your research. I'm absolutely sure that the listeners who are family members of a person with Down syndrome will relate incredibly to the project that you've been through and the information that you found from it. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much. This was great. Thank you.